Welcome to the Workplace Makers podcast. I am joined today by James Dellow, and I feel like James and I have known each other for quite a while. In fact, the time that I can recall we spent most time talking was in 2020 at the Flexible and Agile Working Summit. We were both speakers there, and James had an excellent perspective on how to bring hybrid work, as we now call it, to reality through a human-centered approach. So I loved talking with him there and delving into the techniques he was using and the mindset and the skills he brings to that kind of work. So it's a real pleasure to have him on the show today and to explore more of his background, which actually extends beyond human-centered design. You've got a rich consulting background, James, and this interest in knowledge management. And I know you've started your career early with Ernst & Young and working in their Centre for Business Knowledge, which is an award-winning centre. And it sounds like that has started you off on a journey of being interested in knowledge management, but I'm putting words in your mouth. So you tell us the story. How did you get interested in knowledge management, and what else is there in your career that we should know about?
Thanks, Nina. Yeah, that's right. Look, Ernst & Young did have a big impact on my career and my thinking around technology in the workplace, and knowledge management was definitely a key part of that. And it's probably worth saying that I was with Ernst & Young back in the early 2000s, and they were still using Lotus Notes to collaborate, which when I tell people that, I normally get, and I got a little bit of a reaction from your face when I mentioned it, actually.
I want to burst out laughing.
Yeah.
I am now laughing, yeah.
People either laugh or they complain about it if they ever used it. And then, of course, there's a few people that absolutely loved it. The thing about Ernst & Young is they actually use Lotus Notes really well. And I've never come across an organization that used it, at least in my own direct experience, who used it to the level that they used it, which was really to create a truly truly global knowledge system that wherever you were in the world as an employee, and again, bear in mind, this is early 2000s, no one was talking about hybrid working. I could land anywhere in the world. If there was a telephone line, I could hook that up to my laptop, and I could engage in forums, I could download knowledge bases, I could get the latest thinking on different topics. It really was an impressive tool. Now, usability was kind of a sort of bottom of the rung when it came to Lotus Notes. It wasn't the most pretty tool to use, but in terms of capability, it was really quite clever. Now, I think the interesting thing, though, is a few things I picked up from that experience at EY. Firstly, I was spoiled. When I left Ernst & Young, I thought everyone had this stuff. And I sort of quickly discovered that no, organizations weren't using instant messaging like we were. They didn't even have it in the workplace. It was sometimes banned. And you certainly couldn't just dial in from home or a hotel room and keep on working. So it was quite an extraordinary kind of experience to have compared to what most other organizations had. And that kind of set me on a bit of a path of really trying to bring what EY offered, what it could deliver, and trying to bring that to other organizations that wanted to do that.
Right.
The interesting thing about the knowledge management side, though, is that as much as the information was important, there's a realization that information has a social life. What can be value to me today, it doesn't have value tomorrow, but it might have value to you. And in fact, there was a document I remember we watched move around the world over the space of about a year. And as people in different areas discovered it, they're like, oh, wow, this is really cool. And we're like, yeah, we saw that 12 months ago. We've moved on from that already. So you could see how knowledge moving around. But the other thing is, it was still very much grounded in people collaboration and relationships. And, really sort of, I think one of the things I want to just sort of talk about briefly is the idea of knowledge management. There's so much sort of opinion, different ways of doing it, which is all fair. KM is it's not like the medical profession, right? KM is not a profession in that sense. So we can all approach it in different ways.
Way to always and only ever do it that way.
That's right. That's right. But I think also it's easy to make the mistake of trying to pigeonhole it. That there's this idea that you have information or data, then information, then knowledge, and then wisdom. It's kind of the wrong way of thinking about it. Really, knowledge exists in many different forms. It's in our heads. It's in the social capital, the relationships we have. It is in documents as well. They're all valid kind of concepts of KM. Really, in my mind, is about how you orchestrate the people and the information in an organization to make sure that knowledge can actually move around and be used, or you can create new knowledge. And that really is, I think, for me, the link to this discussion today about how that impacts the hybrid workplace, because I'm constantly looking at what we're doing about, well, how is this actually impacting how we share knowledge, and whether that's a document or it's how I find someone with expertise in my organization, or actually, as you sort of, I guess, if you're looking at it in a more sophisticated way, it's also how you engage with people outside the organization. And that's, that's why we've ended up talking, Nina, because it's like you don't just connect internally, you've got to connect externally as well. Now, if you take that into account, the big shift for me now is that when I was at Ernst & Young and moving through my career in the last few decades, the people who were working remotely, who were working from home, who were starting to use those third places, they were very much the exception. So they were not the norm. Most people were still sat at a desk. They were, if they had a computer, they were sitting at a desktop, and eventually laptops sort of, took over and people started to move around. But we were still pretty much located, anchored to the office.
Yeah.
Suddenly we've shifted, and it's no longer just a small minority, maybe of managers, salespeople, those pesky frontline workers that we didn't realize were so important until COVID happened. They weren't thought about. Most of us were sitting in an office, and we've kind of, again, from a KM point of view, organizations have been very lazy around KM, because when you're sitting next to someone physically, you can just turn to them and ask them a question. But what I've heard also over the years, and I've had a bit of involvement with physical workplace design, looking at the digital layer, and work with interior designers and some of the projects we've gone through. You'll often hear, for example, graduates would complain that, if they were a lawyer, they wanted to sit near the senior partner just to hear conversations, see how they acted, pick up things as they went. So for them, this idea that you could sit at home and remote work would be a terrible thing, because how are you going to address that? So this is what I'm sort of thinking, is that hybrid work is kind of breaking things that were very easy to do when we were co-located, but more so, we actually just took it for granted. We didn't think about it.
It wasn't intentional. It's such a key difference. You mentioned that word lazy, and it's like, the things that we can be lazy about are the things that just come easily. They're not thought about. They're just part of our life anyway. So now I completely agree. Hybrid has put us into a situation where when leaders and teams now need to be quite intentional about how do they get those informal kind of culture transmission moments that you would have got through bumping into someone, mingling, and just being part of the office chatter and hearing things. Yeah,
that's right. That's spot on. That intent is the key thing, because again, with knowledge management, people tend to focus on the word knowledge, and that's where you get these endless debates, which are great over a glass of red wine.
Yeah,
professionally have those chats about, well, what is knowledge? But really, actually, it's two words. It's knowledge management, and it's the intent part that we've really got to think about. And that intent hasn't been there, because again, you think about it, it was a value proposition, wasn't it? We can invest in knowledge management, but as I said, we're all kind of here hanging around. And again, if I need to learn about something, I can rely on the people around me it's a kind of like an apprenticeship model, really. Even in those professions, it's an apprenticeship model, and you learn by just hanging around people. It's kind of like, you would have heard of, the idea of management by walking around. It's kind of like KM by walking around. And that's been the dominant model. So for me, it's sort of, okay, what do we need to now think about around intent for KM in the hybrid workplace?
Great. It's so, I really think it's so important to be thinking about that. And that is one of the areas I've discovered that teams really struggle with and potentially need to do the most work around. And we call it, at Transform Teams, we call that information flow. And so we're really saying, have we got a view on our information flow? Do we know where our information is? What's the quality of that information? Is it accessible? Is it a single source of truth? Is it available on all your devices? Who's going to be excluded from having the information they need to do their job? Has that whole piece been thought about? Which is often a surprising thing, because people think flexibility is a lot about trust, and they think it's more of a there's more of a social dynamic going on with flexibility. But actually, once you delve into, if you take a situation where someone's at home and you've got someone in the office and they've got access to different information, then you can really readily see how there's some technical pieces here that are really key.
Yeah. And so again, if we think about again, this issue of intent, or I sort of look at it from the other angle, it's like this lazy approach to KM. If we start to go back to fundamentals, and I think this is relevant to the discussion around the relationship to the hybrid workplace, is that what is a workplace fundamentally? For me, it's a coordination tool. The physical building coordinates activity by getting us all in the same place at the same time.
Right.
Now, if a colleague is away, even if they're just going on holiday or if they're late for work, it starts to impact that sort of cadence, which is why, I guess management or organizations really would fight against you ever going on leave or ever having time off. This is before we started to worry about wellness and its impact. But, ideally it's like, you're going to be there at 9 o'clock, finish at 5. That's how we coordinate things.
Yeah.
So that, for me, that's the role of the workplace, or was the role of the workplace. Now, there's a whole bunch of other ideas floating around. I look at this sort of idea of, the controlling the means of production. So you've got your building, and that's where you've got to go to work. And then suddenly we've all got mobile phones, and we can use cloud services, and all that's been disrupted. And we start to really reduce our workplace to I guess, what is its key value proposition? And at the moment, people say it's a social space. It's where we want to come together and socialize. Ideally, have maybe some strategic conversations, but it's not about doing the minutiae. Now, again, if we reflect on what some of the interior designers I've worked with and the architects, and I don't know if you've come across this before, Nina, but one of the thing that all of them talk about in office design is about this idea of creating serendipity. Because from serendipity, you do create innovation potentially, but also can improve productivity because you bump into that person who can solve that. So not about new ideas, but just solving current ideas. Yeah. But of course, it can also foster those social connections as well. Yeah. So again,
very much so.
Yeah, our buildings haven't just been this sort of production idea. There's also that for efficient production, you've got to have people also having some random encounters so they can exchange knowledge. Now, of course, we had globalization, and that started to challenge things again anyway. And, years ago, we would have talked about virtual teams and how to build those relationships. But there's we've had all these different little things pulling at that, that physical arrangement. And again, hybrid has suddenly turned that completely upside down. And suddenly, we can't really rely on that physical organization. So that's a topic for another conversation. It's like, what's the reason to come back?
Yeah.
But the point is that we can no longer guarantee that the people we need to work with, either randomly through serendipity or not, even if they're in the same place, they may not be there at the same time. So we're creating all this sort of fracturing of that kind of fundamental value proposition of the workplace. And really the only way you could roll that back is by demanding everyone comes in at the same time. And that's just not going to happen, right?
If you keep the current structures, isn't it? That's the difference, is if you keep things the way they are without that layer of intentionality about the knowledge management piece. And then I think there's a couple of other pieces there around collaboration, although maybe you see that fitting into knowledge management, and certainly around the social and the interpersonal kind of relationship building kind of connections.
Yeah, well, I think if you think about, to your point about the information flows, and I see this more from a symptomatic point of view, and we saw this during, when the lockdown started, is everyone suddenly rushed to work from home. We rushed to roll out Zoom and Teams and all the different video conferencing tools. And we kind of tried to replace that in-office experience with back-to-back meetings. Yeah. Because we need to, it is collaboration and knowledge management are very closely connected. But if you think of it more from the point of view, what's the role, what's kind of the knowledge aspect in collaboration, it's things like situational awareness, what's going on, it is problem solving, it's innovation, those things I mentioned earlier. And so what we're trying to do is say, well, hey, Nina and I, we need to collaborate. There's some knowledge sharing. So I need to get in a meeting with you, but there's 10 other people that need to know, okay, well, we either bring those in or we have 3 follow-up meetings, and suddenly we find our days are a chock-a-block with meetings.
one of my recent clients, when we interviewed the manager level, did a survey with the manager level, they were spending most of their week in meetings. They had 40, so most of them were on a 40-hour-a-week contract, and they were in 40 meetings per week. So, that's at least half the week if each meeting is a half hour, and it's possible up to the whole week. And what they were telling me was they're in meetings all day. And yeah, so it was a perfect example of that problem. Like you say, people have tried to engineer something to solve the knowledge management problem with the simplest tool they've got, which is let's meet. So tell us what some of the other tools are. I know this is your bag. So what do you recommend instead? What's a good solution?
Yeah, so in my mind, again, it's certainly some, not so much new tools, but tools that we are, I guess, are getting smarter, more capable, more broadly applied across the different environments we're using. And I actually mean digital and physical. The amount of data we have about what people do through the systems they're using. But again, that starts with your swipe card going into a building to how many minutes you and I might spend talking on Teams each week. We've got a lot of data as well. So if we just work our way through this, we've got to address this fact of time and space. That hybrid working means that, again, there's no guarantee that we're going to be in the same place at the same time. So we can then look at this from two different angles. One is the idea: do we actually try and replicate or pick up the slack of what we can no longer rely on from that face-to-face perspective? And the other one is actually, can we also use it to perhaps indirectly influence us to try and mitigate that problem? So just to make that a bit more concrete, on one hand, we can use Zoom to talk, and that overcomes the issue that, hey, we're not in the same place at the same time, but we can still have a conversation. And this is still a really valid mechanism for sharing knowledge. And for whatever reason we might want to do it, but we can't afford to have 40-hour weeks of back-to-back meetings because it's physically, emotionally, and it's just not productive. On the other hand, though, you might have come across this idea, and I've tried to use it a little bit lightly on LinkedIn, is talking about in-office days. So we used to talk about out of office.
Yes.
Now we need to talk about in office, because
write it on your signature block. I'm in the office on these days.
That's right.
Yeah, flip it around. Yeah, it's a great idea.
So now we're trying to actually say, look, because I'm definitely all for remote working, but by the same token, there's still a massive role for face-to-face, for that traditional, meet someone, have a coffee, or have a face-to-face meeting, get some post-it notes out. I mean, Miro boards are great, but post-it note, they're sort of just different sides of the coin for me. Again, the mitigations of what you can and can't do. But we can also try, so where I'm going is we can actually try and enable serendipity to an extent, help us to have more chance of being maybe in the same place to have that conversation. Or if you look at some of the other tools, to actually say, hey, James and Nina, you don't know each other, but we look at who you talk to and who you talk to, and places you go and things you're interested in. Maybe you should be connected. And there are already little existing nudge little tools like out there that are like they're out there. Some are random. It's like the random coffee kind of idea. You can have a random coffee meeting organised with your colleagues if you're a fully distributed team.
Wow.
But there's actually no reason why we can't have systems that say, hey, James, if you think of going to the office next week, Thursday morning would be a really great day for you to be there. And in fact, you should sit here, because there might just be more chance that you're going to randomly bump into people that you should be talking to.
Yeah, so use a network tool. You can imagine using a network tool to do that, because you can understand the nodes, who are the connectors within the network, and having influence in that.
I mean, the only issue we've got to overcome there, of course, is still that big brother issue.
Yes.
And all these tools go through a period of improvement, and they have we have very heightened expectations, and they turn out to be a bit dodgy, and then they get better. And they become embedded into work practices that we don't even think about it. So, these things may not be perfect today, but they have potential to keep improving.
Yeah.
And just from a KM point of view, it's kind of like cake layering here. It's kind of very explicit tools to help us share knowledge, overcome that time and space, or try and nudge us towards being around at the same time for that to happen.
Mm.
There's also some other layers, though, I think, that really perhaps where we're seeing perhaps an opportunity to shift gears, again, with more intent and do better, which is actually around how we share information. Because when you go around organizations, we're still doing things. And again, there's actually academic science sort of research around reasons why people don't share knowledge in whatever it might be. Okay. I won't go into that today because that's probably a series of podcasts around this. But, the reasons why people don't put information out there to be used within an organization. But, there's a heck of a lot of information where there's actually no reason why not to.
Yeah.
Now, some of the really simple barriers are things like, well, it's just a draft document. But, if you want to, again, if you think about it, if we want to create serendipity, if people are moving around your digital workplace environment, trying to find information, and they don't know you're working on something, if they go searching and nothing ever comes up, even draft documents, how do people know that people are working on the same problem? So we kind of got to make a more intentional, deliberate sort of mind shift to say, hey, I'll actually start to put more of what I'm working on out there in my organizational public domain. And you can go further, you can even put it on the external public domain. And there's plenty of examples. People have been doing that for years, but again, it's about building intent and making this the norm. There is an art, and if you've ever heard of working out loud, that concept, you can overshare.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So for me,
like
this
leaving
is
out loud, similar idea, leave loudly and working out loud. Yeah.
That's right. So
being known for what you're doing. Exactly.
That's right. So there's a nice middle ground here. You don't want to be an oversharer that shares every work in progress, everything about whatever you might do. So it's kind of transitory stack of information that's not useful. But also, if you undershare, people aren't, you just create this kind of dead space in your digital workplace that's not going to help anyone. So we've got to be more intentional, and it's a skill. People will not necessarily just do this well. And again, this comes back to that laziness issue. It was much easier. I don't have to work out what. I'm already working out loud because I'm sitting in an office having telephone calls that people can overhear.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? I'm having little chats. It was just kind of happening because we're social animals. And we didn't have to think about it. But when we're hybrid, we have to be more deliberate, more intentional about it.
Yeah.
The last sort of box here for me is then sort of mention this idea of situational awareness in the sense from a knowledge management perspective, like what's going on, who's doing what. Oh, have we finished this? Is there something on the horizon we should be concerned about? Is how do we do that? I'm just going to zero in more around sort of teamwork management because it's probably of interest to you and some of the audience. There is an evolving space of work management tools that I've been exploring in recent years, and they started off with around the idea like Kanban boards and tools like Jira. But there's actually quite a big landscape of tools that potentially fit into this realm of work management tools. And if you think about the idea that I've talked about working out loud and very sort of your unstructured information that you're using, emails, documents, team chats, whatever it might be. But then there's a more structured side to this, which is what are the 10 things we need to do this week? Okay. But if you're a manager in an organization, you don't want to see the task list for everyone in your organization. That's not going to help you. That's going to generate information overload. Likewise, just a simple kind of summary of those tasks might not give you the nuance. So we actually need more sophisticated sort of work management tools that, and particularly again in hybrid working where, again, from a knowledge management perspective, if you think about how people make a decision or might decide to do something to solve a problem or approve someone to do something. From a knowledge management point of view, again, when we're inside that traditional bricks and mortar organization, there's lots of social cues and information flowing around that might lead you to say, oh, Nina's put in a rather unusual expense claim for this trip to Australia. What's that about? But you probably would have heard on the oh, Nina's got a conference to go to. Oh yeah, I'll sign off on that. Yeah. So it's all about providing people with the right information, enough information that they can understand what's going on, make good decisions, reallocate resourcing, make approvals, whatever it might be. And that's still, I think, a space that we're still trying to get right. As I said, there's a myriad of tools that fall into this bucket that start to address different pieces. It's OKRs, goal, goal
Yeah.
setting tools,
Mm.
it's feedback tools, it is the task management tools, but it's also even tools that enable you to build low code applications, because again, as a hybrid worker, you need to be empowered. You need to have things that can solve things, and you need to kind of link people together. And again, sometimes it's not enough to just send an email that gets lost, because you're outside of this kind of, again, this co-located context where you can kind of make sense of what's going on with your information. We've got to, I mean, this is the common thread on this side of the story, is about making things more explicit, but we've got to do it in the right way. So it's not about having more meetings. It's not about having hundreds of Kanban boards. We've actually got to have more sophisticated tools to make sure that the right people, when they're looking at that information, it makes sense. And there's got to be a social layer.
Yeah.
So work management is an evolving area, I think, where there's more to do to get that right, to work out what that right mix of tools and capabilities are. But just, I do wonder, people hear me talk about work management and they're maybe not quite clear on what I mean, and particularly around the social layer you need to have around it. Well, it's not enough just to, as I said, to have a Kanban board. Many years ago, I was working with an accounting team for an international business, and each month they had their financial numbers come in from all the different regions. And the original ask was to actually develop what they call day one reporting. At the end of the month, you can immediately come back with the numbers. And from a sort of business analyst point of view, that all sounded like a reasonable collaboration proposition. And we were thinking up on these ideas of how they could get their numbers in and generate this kind of report or whatever it might be that had all the figures. But then the accountant sort of said, whoa, hold on. Maybe day two would be more realistic. And we sort of said, hang on, but we were asked to do this day one. We just need to get your numbers in. And they said, yeah, but we've got to talk. We've got to talk about those numbers to explain and understand what each one is what we're contributing, to make sure it all makes sense. And now that particular story also mirrored one of my, even before Ernst & Young, one of my other sort of early KM moments was actually working in medical records. And it's a little bit depressing, but in hospitals they have death audits. If someone dies, they want to understand why that happened. Could things have been done differently? And again, the doctors would sit around in a circle and they talk through the files, because there was a realization that even what's in the file isn't enough, or you need more context. You need to question it.
Yeah, that's
right. So work management is not about sort of mechanizing, automating how we do work. It's not about us just having a task list and assigning it to people. It's about recognizing that's part of it, but we actually have to have a social layer, because there's a knowledge component to collaboration, whether it's understanding the bigger picture, understanding whether people have all the information they need to go forward and do something, have they even understood what they need to do. We're not trying to automate people. Basically, hybrid work shouldn't end up with us creating tools just to make us sort of more efficient. It's not about sort of sausage factory process. It very much is a human process, but we're just trying to, it's almost like, our senses are, I'm limited by what I can see and hear around me. We're trying to almost make us superhuman a little bit, because we want to extend our sort of understanding what's going on in our workplace, when our workplace is spread across time and space. So maybe there's a nice idea. We're superheroes in the hybrid workplace.
Well, when you put it like that, I think of the connection with how knowledge, our access to knowledge has increased so much, and there's so much, knowledge and information processing power that now sits outside our brain, and we're now peer-to-peer networked in a way like we've never been peer-to-peer networked before. So we're living in this networked age with a lot of information, knowledge sitting outside our heads, and one of the key ways to succeed in that environment is to be as cognizant as you can be what knowledge is outside your own space. So and where do you need to be to kind of get connected to that knowledge, because it could the sophistication, the complexity of it means that the scale of impact could actually be even greater. It could blindside you, for want of a better word, without you knowing, because we're more vulnerable, as I guess, as through that complexity of information that we now depend on. So, that all that stuff comes from one of those from a network book, which I will put the links. I'll put the link into the podcast. It was fascinating read about what it's like to live in the network.
Yeah, I'd probably just like to sort of maybe just put forward one final point as well. I'm not trying to KM, my sort of discussion of KM, I'm not trying to own the space, but it's just another, and this is what I think good KM practitioners will say, is we're just trying to provide a lens through which you understand what's going on. And it doesn't override the things you might want to do around employee experience to promote hybrid working. We want to care about wellness of our employees when they're working remotely, or if people are fearful of coming back into the office, whatever it might be. None of this overrides that, but it's just saying we actually need to consider KM, and to this point we've made a few times, is it's about being intentional and deliberate with how we do things, and recognizing that it's not enough just to have meetings. It's not enough just to have a workflow that tells people to do things.
Yeah,
we've got to deliberately build this KM ecosystem, which is it's information, it is documents and comments and chat. It is video conversations, but it's also analytics that look at how we relate to each other, those networks, and using that information. It's sort of it's a whole kit of different strategies and opportunities we can pursue, because ultimately we just want to make hybrid work. That's the most important thing.
Exactly. And I think that's where I see it not being in conflict at all with the employee experience, because what does it mean to be someone who comes to work and who finds that experience of work satisfying? It means that you can achieve your work successfully. And I think what hybrid has done is put barriers in place for a lot of people that weren't there previously. It's harder to find that informal knowledge around how is the culture here? What are the ways of working? What is prioritized? What is important to our leadership team now that wasn't important a month ago? And all that kind of key information is ostensibly out of reach if you're not connected in those informal ways that people have had in the past. So I actually see this as being central to the employee experience. It's very much about how do people come to work, not just to feel well at work, but to achieve their work successfully. I think there's a really key piece here.
I'm excited I brought you into the KM fold, Nina. That's
one
person.
I'm now a card-carrying member by this time of it. I didn't realize I was. Here I was calling it information flow. So no, I appreciate it. I think it's a really cool kind of, I feel like we've just peeked under the lid to see what's in the knowledge management sector, and and if you call it a sector, or in the practice, or in that knowledge area, it's really fascinating that the thinking is happening around how do we put this layer in place, this intentional layer, to not miss the key information that gets work done. Yep. Thanks, James. Anything that you would like to recommend to a leader today who recognizes through the conversation that they do have a knowledge management issue? What would be your recommendation to them?
Well, you started off by talking about my sort of background in human-centered design, and we've finished with sort of connecting it back to employee experience. And I think for me, I would say to those leaders, I'm sure you've got employee experience projects and initiatives happening. What we want to do really with KM is not come in with a KM project per se, but we just want to make sure we apply that KM lens to your employee experience. So don't stop, but actually start to ask those other questions around. So it's great that we've given people the leave policy, we've given them the benefits, we've given them a tech budget, whatever it might be. But have you also answered those sort of fundamentals about and how are we going to share knowledge, how we're going to work more effectively? That needs to be part of your EX planning and strategy as well. So that, just don't miss that bit of the puzzle. That'd probably be the one thing I would say to a leader.
And that would be great advice and a great point to end on. Thank you so much, James. Thanks for joining us. Again, always a really interesting conversation with you, and just fantastic to share these insights. And I think for people to become aware of the knowledge management practice and and the value it can add. Thank you so much.
No worries. Great chatting to you, Nina.
Thanks.